Okay, right, outside it's windy today, so I'm not sure how well you're going to be able to hear me. Noise is obviously able to try and a little bit, see if I can make that a little bit better. How's that? Yeah, there we go. Okay, right. Back on trying tyrosine with my breakfast, and seeing how that's going. I'll admit that I think it might be better in the evening. I think I'll go into it in a bit, but a lot of it comes down to it affects my sleep the same way, really. I think it's just I end up with more energy, kind of. My mind is kind of racing a bit more. That's why I've got a load of really random, sporadic thoughts. And you're about to hear. I'm about to hear. I'm tackling one of those, trying to hold it. Right. Despite having a less than satisfactory night's sleep, the day after taking the tyrosine with my dinner has been one of the best days in a long while, with absolutely no real negative thought patterns and an inherent appreciation of existence. I did take the multivitamin with my breakfast too, which I think helps. I'll try reverting to taking tyrosine with my breakfast also, instead of with dinner, to see if I can have the same quality day without interfering with my sleep pattern. If the quality of day is not as good, I'll happily sacrifice sleep quality for mental health quality and take it with dinner. I think it was actually a better day when I took it with dinner. I still feel obviously infinitely better than when I wasn't taking it at all, if I take it with breakfast. But I think you just I'll go into it a bit more, but it's all to do with digestion and circadian rhythms and stuff like that, I reckon. Okay. Oh fuck, no, that's where I was. Okay. If it's true that Hobbes thought we all acted in our own self-interest, then he was right. If for some reason, well, I think he was right. If for some reason he believed this entailed that we were inherently violent, he was misguided. Whilst it's true that we are good at being violent under normal conditioning, and most humans carry at least a modest capacity for violence given the right situational triggers, it is also true that we have become far more intelligent than relying on violence as our primary method of persuasion and manipulation. Now, manipulation isn't necessarily malicious either. The very emotion of empathy, although Paul Bloom may have something else to say on the matter, is an essential tool for acting in our self-interest by feeling involved with the interests of others. Mutually beneficial or symbiotic relationships can offer far greater yield than ancient slave-oppressor dynamics, which I've just made up, I think. And thus one would expect natural selection, which I argue applies to sociological and psychological phenomena almost as much as biological ones. One would expect natural selection to favour those symbiotic relationships. Perhaps game theory can shed some light on this line of reasoning. I've got to learn CAD and do Code Academy. That's my current plan. What I'm going to do. I'm also thinking I want to do mechanical engineering and electrical engineering, which I guess is kind of mechatronics, but I don't actually want to do mechatronics. I kind of want to do them separately. And you know what? I'll fucking do the Python as well, because that could be very handy. And hopefully I'll be able to enjoy it now. Alright. I've noticed a minor flaw in my reasoning towards certain individuals who ascribe certain labels to themselves. My view that labels should be avoided, if at all possible, has led me to realise that for me to respond to people who do use these labels religiously, if you'll pardon the pun, you will, for me to respond by being just as dependent on that label as anyone else is counterintuitive. The whole point of my anti-label spiel is that we should treat individual views as individually as we can, as doing otherwise can force people into beliefs that are ill-founded and that they might not otherwise subscribe to. Take the obvious case of the Christian. I'm sure the vast majority of Christians believe Jesus was a pretty great guy. I mean Jesus. Even I think he was probably a decent dude, if he existed. But even as a fictional character, the same admiration can be felt, forgetting supernatural miracles, of course, for someone who does good things. But the amount of Christians who would sooner than make the leap to giving up the label of Christian, apply a reduced level of scrutiny to wacky ideas like a divine creator of the universe. But the amount of Christians who would sooner than make the leap to giving up the label of Christians, apply a reduced level. So sooner than doing that, they would apply a reduced level of scrutiny to wacky ideas like a divine creator of the universe who listens to all their prayers. It's probably quite high. Okay, so it's more likely that someone will apply less scrutiny to a certain belief thought under the label of Christian rather than give up the label of Christian, if they think that's what a Christian has to do. Anyway, obviously informed estimations and assumptions based on experience are often correct. But in terms of avoiding intellectual trench warfare, I think we'd be better off avoiding labels ourselves and placing less emphasis on those used by others. Jesus Christ, what a moron I am. If the brain contains some number of billions of neurons, but with trillions of connections between them, and a smartphone contains billions of transistors, in its relatively tiny processor, surely we can create a processor, fucking hell, with as much theoretical processing power as the brain by increasing the number of connections between each transistor. I imagine, which is dangerous when you know absolutely nothing. Which is dangerous when you know absolutely nothing about the subject matter. The current systems utilise a 1-to-1 interaction between transistors, or a 2-to-1, or 1-to-2 or something. Anyway, what would be the effect of making each transistor able to interact with upwards of 3 other transistors in a more complex complex? Also, to enable this, a more 3D structure would be required, as opposed to the planar one that the flat design of most processors leads me to believe is the norm. Fucking hell, Jesus Christ, this wind's probably making it... I'm going to have to do this all over again, probably. Okay, oh my god, I've got so many more stuff to do. Now this might well be my wackiest, most speculatory, if that's a word, and least fact-based theory yet. So current machine learning models of neural nets obviously utilise simulated neural nets, in that their form is not directly determined by their physical manifestation in the world, although of course they are, inasmuch as all things must be at some level, but I digress. Whilst brains use literal physical neural nets, I was thinking about my idea to create a more brain-like processor by creating more neurons, more numerous connections between transistors, and this led me to question how it is brains actually work. We know, or at least we believe strongly, that memories are the result of strengthening of certain neural pathways, which involves the creation of new neurons and the development of older ones. Now, physical CPUs would struggle with this. The microscopic live editing of individual neurons is quite complicated at this time for us to create. Anyway, however, I also question the simplicity of this theory. When we forget a memory, do the old neurons just die and disappear, or are neurons better thought of as having multiple roles, and a single neuron's multiple synapses are of more critical importance? Just like how our simulated neural nets develop branch weighting through data analysis, our neurons strengthen and weaken certain pathways by adjusting the levels of neurotransmitter receptors and the neurotransmitters themselves. And sorry about that. Right, I need to try and get this going again. Where the hell was I? Our neurons strengthen and weaken certain pathways by adjusting the levels of neurotransmitter receptors and the neurotransmitters themselves. I wonder whether this is why my perception on all things is. I wonder whether this is why my perception on all things is able to change so drastically from when on tyrosine. The receptor levels would remain constant for the most part, but the increased level of dopamine allow increased receptor activation and cause an alteration in mind, mood, and I would argue consciousness. Jesus Christ, I sound like a fucking psycho. In essence, in the same way the neural nets add what I believe to be a sort of probability weighting to certain pathways, certain branches of the probability tree type thing, neural net tree anyway, our neurons achieve much the same result by increasing the amount of receptor expression at certain synapses. What's also interesting is that unless there is backward propagation of information, which I don't suppose would be too hard to imagine, perhaps increased receptor expression would mean reduced reuptake of transmitters, which can be interpreted by these presynaptic neurons. That's helpful. Yeah, that's really helpful. That's great. By the presynaptic neuron. However, if this isn't what occurs, then the postsynaptic neurons would be in control of pathway strengthening, and so there would be a sort of top-down approach to learning. Maybe that's the wrong wording. Result-oriented, maybe? Anyway, it would also link to my more universal idea of natural selection. A neuron achieves some kind of outcome, largely by chance, causing it to express higher numbers of certain receptors, e.g. dopamine, causing the neuron that activated it to follow the same process. I also wonder whether the different neurotransmitters and their receptors affect how the same neural pathway gets experienced consciously. I imagine each neurotransmitter will elicit largely different neural responses from the following neuron. But I also wonder if the same pathway activated to the same extent just by different transmitters would be experienced differently. The reason I say it would have to be a top-down learning method would be because there would be, I'm assuming, no direct interaction between the first and last neuron in a particular pathway/sequence, and therefore if a certain pathway elicits a desirable and self-sustaining or naturally selecting result, the trigger of that pathway, or at least the primary neurons involved in its propagation, would be none the wiser. Only as that same pathway was initiated with the receptor upregulation reach its way back to the primary neurons. Perhaps this is why repetition is so essential to learning. I quite like the idea of primary neurons being like microhubs for starting multiple neural pathways. All neurons are vastly interconnected, but perhaps certain pockets of neurons are even more interconnected with their neighbours, behaving like superneurons. They are connected to a much higher number of neurons by far more axons and synapses, and are the starting point for multiple, and they just have more axons and synapses, and are the starting point for multiple common neural pathways with common themes, like related memories, thoughts, and ideas. The other neurons closer to the end of fewer neural pathways become more specialized and have less interplay with other neurons. Also, the way all this translated back into deep learning, would be that instead of having a few neurons at the base of the entire neural net, these neurons too would be involved in many more connections, and so too with the ones at the end of the neural nets. Also, if my theory about different neurotransmitters isn't complete bullshit, the weighting of certain probability branches would have to be subject to change depending on the input, although I'm not sure how much I follow my own logic on this, because it is my understanding that neurons either activate an action potential or don't, and so they rely on transmitting electricity from their postsynaptic synapse to a presynaptic one within the same neuron. And so if it is essentially a single binary unit of information, on or not on, they couldn't transmit any information about which transmitter had activated them. So my guess would be that receptor expression of the postsynaptic neuron determined the conductivity of a pathway, because they would make themselves more or less inclined to be activated in the presence of different transmitters. Okay, that's very poorly worded for what I'm trying to express, but anyway. E.g., if there's loads of dopamine being released but hardly any dopamine receptors, it won't be activated very often. Likewise, if there's hardly any serotonin released but loads of serotonin receptors, it will also be activated very often, but about as much as the dopamine scenario. Well, that is just pure stream consciousness, but hey ho. I forgot to mention that I think the formation of memory and the like, whilst it does involve the formation of some new neurons, which is partly why the brain grows throughout a lifetime, I think there's also a repurposing component, where existing neurons become more specialized by many processes. They probably alter their receptor expressions and form new connections with close-by neurons. So maybe they create new synapses and new axons. Anyway, to make new connections. And I think that sounds an awful lot like what people already say. I think my differences in my ideas of someone being intelligent versus smart or clever, or smart or clever, intelligent versus smart or clever, is something like this. You can't be born intelligent, but you can be born smart. At least my definition is that. Intelligence is a measure of how much you have learned, while smartness is a measure of how much you can learn stuff, or rather, how quickly you can learn things intuitively. And even that's just terribly worded again. What if Tesla just had the most outrageously long bipolar cycle, with very short, in comparison, but very, very intense downswings? That's just because he claimed to go in kind of almost catatonic state, I don't know, he'd be hardly asleep and all that, and then he'd almost die. Well, the doctors were telling him that they thought he was going to die, anyway, whatever. Okay, I'm going to read that one. These crazy ideas seem to be coming about 13 hours after taking the tyrosine, and were accompanied by a very morning glory-like unprovoked erection. Assuming most people get their tyrosine boost from their dinner, is it possible that the reason we supposedly do our best work in the morning, approximately 13 hours after our dinner, and get morning glories, is because this is when the tyrosine from our food kicks in? And of course, I'm assuming that there is something between tyrosine, dopamine, and erections. I think the conception of infinite possibilities, meaning anything a person can imagine would be occurring in an infinite universe, would occur somewhere. Hang on. Meaning anything a person can imagine would be occurring in an infinite universe somewhere is wrong. Hopefully, I'm right in saying the proofs of bigger and smaller infinities, e.g. rational numbers and, some other infinity, show that you can have infinitely many possibilities and states in a finite set of parameters. There could be infinitely many... that doesn't really make sense, but I hope it does. So, between the numbers 1 and 2, there are infinitely many fractions, you know what I mean? Anyway, but that's between two finite parameters, if you like. There could be infinitely many universes with differences occurring only in the number of atoms in the universe, or the orientation of one atom in that universe, or something trivial that has no real impact on the thing. And there'd still be infinitely many universes, but there'd be you don't have to assume that therefore anything could happen. Anyway. And at no point in any of those universes would anything Rick and Morty-like be more likely to occur. So just because there are infinite universes doesn't mean that there has to be a universe somewhere where you're in a Minecraft universe. I've stated before my absolute disgust for the argument from nature fallacy, that is so often used by many hippie types, despite my actual respect for the hippie movement at its core. However, I'm not sure if I do respect it, I don't know. I think peace is a good thing. Anyway, however, this fallacy isn't always as unhelpful as it sometimes can be. In certain situations, a kind of argument from nature can be quite informative. The very study of evolutionary science can give us valuable insights into the optimal states for our bodies to function. We know that our bodies evolved to work with certain nutrients, and so getting an adequate amount of those nutrients. This sounds like I'm trying to sell tyrosine as a thing now. It was just trying to use an example of how some things evolved and therefore we can, they evolved. We evolved with them for a reason. Well, I never mind. We evolved in that way, and then to not go against it might cause damage to our health. Not. Oh, never mind. Okay. What was I? We know that our bodies evolved to work with certain nutrients, and so getting an adequate amount of those nutrients in our diet can have serious health benefits. Just think in calories. Okay, we evolved to eat food. If we didn't eat food, we wouldn't live as well. It's kind of an argument for nature, but anyway, it's more like an argument from physiology. And so sometimes when I ponder whether taking tyrosine with dinner might be more beneficial, it does have its roots in how I believe we would have evolved to function optimally. I imagine we were limited by daylight hours as to our hunting times and sleeping patterns, and so would develop a general eating time. And consequently, over time, our body would become adapted to digesting at certain times of day better than others. Perhaps this time was close to dinner or lunchtime, because it took time from us to wake up to hunt and kill, and then our digestion became related to our circadian rhythm. So maybe my body would extract the compounds from the tablets more effectively if consumed around this time with dinner to kickstart the digestion process. Jesus Christ. I was also considering the case of my friend, whom many of my friends and myself suspected to be gay, despite his assertions that he wasn't. My suspicion was largely centered around, surprisingly, not his relationships with other males, but more so by his relationship with women. I believe it is possible to have more or less entirely platonic relationships between heterosexual males and females, but they vary by degrees, and also, with of course exceptions to the rule, it is not the default status. I believe the kindling for most friendships between heterosexual members of opposite sexes is an at least low-level non-platonic attraction, and so my suspicions were aroused by the apparent lack of this innate attraction on the part of my suspected homosexual friend. Just an idea there. Anyway, despite having a less than satisfactory night's sleep, the day after taking the tyrosine with my dinner has been one of the best days in a long while. Oh, did I edit this one? Oh yeah, I'm reading it again now. Yeah, okay, right, that's all. Jesus Christ. Right, I'm off to the cinema. Bye.